So now we're going to switch from episodes to disorders, okay? So in major depressive disorder, there are one or more of those depressive episodes that we described. In bipolar 1 disorder, there's at least one manic episode with or without major depressive episodes. So a person has one manic episode during their lifetime, boom, bipolar 1 disorder, whether they've had a depressive episode or not. Bipolar 2 disorder, you have at least one hypomanic episode and one major depressive episode. You have to have both a hypomanic episode and a major depressive episode to be considered bipolar 2 disorder. There's also persistent depressive disorder, which is a major depression or chronic subsyndromal depressive symptoms, a kind of long-lasting, smoldering depression that may or may not meet the full criteria. We call that dysthymia. So that we call persistent depressive disorder if it's lasted 2 or more years. Then there's cyclothymia, which is a fluctuation between subsyndromal hypomanic symptoms and subsyndromal depressive symptoms. There we call that patient cyclothymic. So you see how the symptoms which define the episodes, and the episodes and the combination of episodes defines the disorder. So I really want you to think carefully about the distinction between episodes and disorders. Now, you don't need to be an adult to figure this whole thing out because Winnie the Pooh lays it all out for you, okay? So let's look at the various characters and the diagnoses that they might have. So Winnie the Pooh has been described as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and certainly borderline intellectual functioning, otherwise known as mental retardation. You see some of his medical conditions include obesity and binge eating. Piglet, on the other hand, you could diagnose with generalized anxiety disorder. Eeyore is the perfect example of dysthymic disorder. Depression is almost part of his personality. And he may not meet the full criteria for depression, but you know that donkey is depressed. Rabbit can be described as having a narcissistic personality disorder. The rabbit always thinks that he knows everything. Tigger, now this is very interesting. Tigger is described in this paper. This is actually in a Canadian medical journal. He's described as having ADHD, being hyperactive and impulsive. I disagree with that diagnosis. I think he perfectly meets the criteria of bipolar 2 disorder with hypomanic episodes. And then we get to Christopher Robin, who is described as having gender identity disorder of childhood. Again, I disagree with that. I think he has schizophrenia because who else spends his days talking to animals? Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about persistent depressive disorder, as I know it as Eeyore. Depressed mood for at least 2 years. Now, you don't need to meet the full criteria of a major depressive episode. You can, and it's a major depressive episode that's lasted at least 2 years, but you could just meet the following criteria. 2 of the following: sleep disturbance, appetite disturbance. Remember, that can be hypersomnia or insomnia, increased appetite or decreased appetite. They've got low energy, low self-esteem, poor concentration, and feelings of hopelessness. So you just need 2 of those for 2 years or more, and they've never been out without these symptoms for more than 2 months. It includes people who've had chronic major depression, as well as people who have some subsyndromal depression as defined by the criteria that I'm just showing you. It's formerly known as dysthymia. That word was taken out of the DSM in 2013, but you're going to be walking around with people who are trained before DSM-5, and they'll be calling it dysthymia, so you really need to know what that is. What's the mnemonic there? A choose. Appetite changes, concentration, hopelessness, low energy, worthlessness, and sleep disturbance. And look at this dysthymia rule of 2s. At least 2 symptoms for a minimum of 2 years, and never without symptoms for more than 2 months. So if you memorize this slide, you're golden. All right, now what's another mood disorder? Cyclothymia. Here you've got fluctuations between subsyndromal hypomanic and depressive symptoms, and again, at least for 2 years. These episodes have met, actually they're not episodes because they're subsyndromal. They're symptoms that have met some, but not all criteria for a major depressive episode or hypomania. If you take somebody for a 2-year period, and they've had times where they've been down and they're sleeping more and their appetite is changed, but they don't have the full criteria. And then at other times in those 2 years, they're really happy, they may need less sleep, they may do some risky stuff, but they don't meet the full criteria for a hypomanic episode. So they're vacillating between these two clusters of symptoms without ever meeting the criteria of a full-blown episode. And we call that cyclothymia. All right, so let's put it all together. So on the bottom, we're talking about episodes. Severe depressive episodes, moderate depressive episodes, normal, which means neither depressed nor manic or hypomanic. Then we got hypomanic episodes and manic episodes. On the top where you see all those arrows are the actual disorders which are comprised of the episodes. So bipolar 1 describes a fluctuation between mania and severe depression. Mind you, they can be called bipolar 1 if they've only had a manic episode. They don't need to have had the depressive episodes as well, but for the majority of patients with bipolar 1, they do have episodes of mania as well, and fluctuating with episodes of severe depression. And they can have periods where they're just completely normal in the middle. Bipolar 2 fluctuates between hypomanic episodes and major depressive episodes, because with bipolar 2, if you just had a hypomanic episode, we can't say bipolar 2. There has to be other periods where a person meets criteria for a major depressive episode. Cyclothymia fluctuates between subsyndromal hypomania and subsyndromal major depressive episode. So you can see here with cyclothymia, it goes halfway. It doesn't go the whole way on either pole. Then you've got unipolar major depression, which meets the criteria for severe, or not even severe, just meets the criteria for a major depressive episode. And then you have dysthymia. Remember the rule of 2s, where they have to meet the Achoo's criteria, which is just 2 symptoms that I showed you, and they're considered dysthymic. So in that case, they stay in this range with moderate depressive symptoms lasting for 2 years or more. Then you've got the unipolar depression, and the only thing they have is recurrent episodes of major depressive episodes. And persistent depression comprises those people with unipolar depression and those that meet the criteria for dysthymia. We call those patients having persistent depressive disorder. So this slide really is key in determining differences between mood episodes and mood disorders. All right, let's go through a multiple choice question. So you got a 53-year-old guy who's had several episodes of hypomania, but has never had depressive symptoms. Which of the following diagnoses applies? Bipolar 1, cyclothymia, none, just call them lucky, and bipolar 2 disorder. And the answer actually is none, just call them lucky. If the hypomanic episodes have not been associated with any dysfunction, we don't call that a disorder. Disorders or episodes must be associated with distress and or significant impairment in function. So if a person's had a hypomanic episode without consequences, good for him or her. That's what we'd all like to have because it feels really good. Now I want to note that the DSM-5 also has these basket categories for illnesses that are associated with distress or functional impairment, but don't meet the full criteria for anything else I've just showed you. So then we call it other specified or unspecified bipolar disorder. Not important to know the difference between those two. It's used when symptoms don't meet criteria. And an example would be an individual who's had a hypomanic episode or multiple, but never had a major depressive episode. We wouldn't call that other specified bipolar disorder unless there was evidence of clinically significant symptoms, in other words, distress, and or functional impairment, which is just what I basically said. Okay, that will be the end of part 1, and now let's go to part 2.